everyone. Welcome to hello everyone. Welcome to the another IBAC session. Today we have Mason with us. So to give a brief about what will be today's talk about. So Mason will be talking about the graduate application and the admission processes that happen in US for physics PhD programs. He will be also giving us advice to other STEM fields as well. So the entire purpose of this talk is like what should be our statement of purpose. So when are we applying or pursuing a graduate school, what factors one should consider about it, and also he will help us understand the about the process. Also demystify some things related to the processes itself. And I hope that it will be a great opportunity for all of you to learn from this talk. To talk about the speaker, Mason is a fifth-year physics PhD student at MIT Boston. He's currently working under Professor Deepto Chakraborty on X-ray timing and spectroscopy on neutron stars. He's also currently working with Dr. Herman Marshall on extrapolarimetric observation of neutron stars. He has done his bachelor's in physics and mathematics, as well as honors in physics from University of Auckland in New Zealand. And Mason is very interested in using the observational tools to understand the evolutional and dynamics of interacting neutron star binaries. So, Mason, it's really glad to have you with us. And yes, you can start it.
Okay, yeah, no, thanks for the introduction, and also my thanks to Pamita Pandey, who first approached me at a conference earlier this year to suggest the idea, and of course to Devang for organizing all of this behind the scenes. I also say that I'm hoping to talk to more student groups around the country at other ISIS and IIT, so I'm happy to be put in touch with others from the various schools as well. Having said that, I will also want to preface by saying that I have my email up there, but I'll only limit interactions to short follow-ups from this because I can't, if there are questions from too many people, I won't be able to answer them. So, Devang has already read my bio, but let me also introduce myself as one of the previous grad student members of the MIT Physics Graduate Admissions Committee. So what that meant is that I had first-hand experience going through something like 800 applications. I've read something like 2,500 reference letters, a lot of reading, but it means that I have gotten a lot of experience learning about what works and what doesn't work in terms of the graduate applications. And I've been part of the conversations that talks about who gets admitted as well. And as Devon was also saying, a lot of the grad application process is very unknown, it's very opaque, even to typical grad students. And as an international student myself, doing undergrad outside the US, I didn't really know much about how the system all worked in the first place. So this first part will be me trying to demystify the process and answer questions about it. Having said that, though, a lot of the advice and insights that I have are, they're still relevant to the admissions processes of today, even though I'm not directly in it anymore. But the advice will still be relevant, but also none of this is kind of official guidance or advice by the admissions committee per se. Just because you hear me say things, you're not going to be guaranteed to get into to MIT or any grad school. But of course, I hope that what I say will help in the process. And my perspective will be someone from MIT Physics, but a lot of the advice would generally apply to not just MIT Physics, but also to physics PhD programs around the US, and also in general STEM programs around the country, because the process is quite similar. And lastly, I will say that the admissions process is quite stochastic, so outcomes can be quite different for two people with similar profiles, and so it can be hard to predict sometimes. So kind of to set the stage, one thing I will note, and it's not meant to be a note of disclaimer, it's just kind of not to discourage anyone, but it's more of a kind of the reality is that there are many more applications than there are spots available in MIT Physics, or even just in physics PhD programs in the country. So take MIT Physics. For example, I'm showing here kind of the number of people who have applied and the people who are admitted, and ultimately the people who accept the offer to MIT. And in the 2022 cycle from last year, there were something like 1,600 applications. 90 were admitted and 42 accepted the offer in the end. And many of you see that number and you probably went to your calculator and did 90 divided by 1672, and that's 5.4%. And it is maybe easy to, or it might be tempting to think about it as a probability, but you should not think of a probability when you're thinking about numbers in this way, because the process is stochastic. But at the same time, it's also not entirely random. You want to be considering your profiles. And I'll talk about what that means in a few minutes. But again, I just wanted to kind of point out kind of the stakes. But MIT is MIT. There are various schools with quote unquote much more encouraging numbers. But kind of going back to the start, I wanted to lay out the first consideration that you want to make is, and whether graduate school is right for you in the first place. It is a long process. It's something like 5 to 6 years, and that does include taking classes as well. Unless you're doing a PhD in, say, Australia or Europe. I think back home in India as well, PhDs are generally just project based. So your PhDs are typically 3 to 4 years. But the question, in for any PhD program, be it wherever it is, you want to ask yourself about whether you're interested in a research-based career. That means developing the necessary skills and techniques and background for tackling some of the more pressing questions in whatever field that you're interested in. That can be done in academia, that can be done in industry. But you do want to ask yourself whether that's the right thing for you to do, because there are some folks that just jump into grad school thinking that it's a natural thing for them to do because they, you might have a really a good GPA in school, you did really well in classes, and then you might think that graduate school is the next natural thing. But it's, again, 5 to 6 years of your life, and you should think about that carefully. Okay, now I will start going into kind of the checklist of things that graduate applications look at. And I'm not just going to list them one by one and call it a day. I will talk about what kind of the insider perspective for our admissions company, what we look for. So, but there's some things which are kind of bookkeeping in some way. So, we have an online application, which is just asking for biographical data. You mostly know that, so you just kind of fill that in and without thinking too much. And academic transcripts are also just a very standard affair. We do look at them, but there's not too much more to say about that. One thing that I didn't know before applying to grad school in the US is that they ask for application fees, which is stupid in my opinion and prohibitive, because people, it can be hard to afford those fees. And having said that, waivers are possible even for international students. You just gotta know where to find them and ask the right people. And there, at least at MIT, there's a process for this. And then finally, the last point there are also letters of recommendation or reference letters, and generally MIT asks for 3. You can submit up to 6. But we usually look at the first 3, and the vast majority submits 3. Some people submit 4, but you run into the issue of, if the 4th one is not so great, then it makes it pulls your whole application down. And in a few slides, I will talk a bit more about what we look at for the recommendation letters. Some other things as well that we look at, academic transcripts, reference letters are kind of standard stuff. And obviously we do ask about research experiences as well, and whether you've given talks, whether you have papers, or whether you have given presentations at conferences. But we do ask about other stuff as well, like awards, fellowships, volunteering efforts, extracurricular activities, teaching, service. And I'll talk about that in kind of the next slide. And then there's also the statement of objectives or statement of purpose, and a personal statement that's optional for MIT. And I think the last thing I'll say is that regarding the PGRE, so I'm not sure how much of a contention this is in India, but there is in the last few years, MIT had not been accepting the GRE or the physics GRE scores because it was hard to get the exams. But
Yeah,
okay.
sorry, continue.
No worries. So in the last few years, the PGRE, GRE were not accepted, and in the last year and this year, while the general GRE will not be accepted, the physics GRE will be optional. Now, the first question that you probably ask is, well, how optional is optional, right? And again, I was not involved in the committee last year, but I'm still active in the conversations, and I know that in last year's applications, only 5 to 10% of the applicants actually submitted the scores, which is honestly a lot less than I thought. And there was even quite a variance. You might think that people who submitted their scores only submitted because they're really good, but I've learned that people submit a variance of scores. I did not also expect that, but I guess it is what it is. I don't know what the correlation is between those who submitted their scores and those who got in, though. That's kind of an ongoing analysis at the moment. Okay, now kind of going into the more meaty part of the application, so about the statements. And I'll primarily be talking about the statement of objectives or the statement of purpose. They both mean the same thing. But there's some points that are relevant to the personal statement too. So, when we read over your statements, there are a few questions that we are asking ourselves, and indirectly you as well. The first one is, how are you a good fit to the department or the division at MIT? Do you have research interests that overlap or adjacent to the faculty members that you want to work with? And if so, how do your background, skills, and your intentions potentially line up? You don't necessarily have to have a strong or even a background in your topic per se. And that's absolutely fine. You are going to graduate school, you're not applying to a job to do a certain thing. But you do want to focus on your background and the skills you have developed and how they are relevant to the potential work that you're doing. And then relatedly, do you have the potential to be a good researcher? Note here it says potential. You don't have to be like a genius or whatever to get into grad school. I'm very far from one. And there are various ways to demonstrate that potential. The most visible one, of course, is having a first author publication. But that's no mean the only way to demonstrate that experience. I mentioned before things like talks, conference posters, doing research in a variety of fields, various side projects you may have that are either in class or out of class. People have talked about developing apps, for example, and that's not something that they were doing in class. But also class projects are also all possible. And then we also look for soft qualities like resiliency and taking initiative. If, say, for example, you don't have research opportunities at home, or you don't have research opportunities in the topics or field that you're interested in, have you reached out to other places? Have you applied to opportunities elsewhere? What did you do? And that includes overseas as well. And also from the 800 applications I've read, and from what I've seen of others, I've not just read those 800 applications. I've been helping undergrads with their applications over the last few years as well. And one thing that I know, that myself for sure, but also other people on the admissions committees, they very few read the statements in the entirety word by word. Those 1,000 or 2 pages, we usually read them in something like 30 to 45 seconds. So you need, 2 pages in 30 to 45 seconds. Just kind of imagine that. Imagine reading a whole newspaper article in like 15 seconds. So you do need to grab their attention quick. The most common pitfall that I've seen is a whole starting paragraph that talks about how general relativity and quantum mechanics have revolutionized physics, and how the next big thing is this field. And that's great. It shows that you've done your reading, but the committee already knows that. You want to focus more on your research interests, your background, and highlight your achievements. So kind of the last point I have there is, to focus on what you have done. I usually look out for the word I a lot. So, not just we, but I worked on this, I've done this, I started this thing, I finished this project, whatever. And that's very important. And it's basically the only word that I actively look out for. And I know for various faculty and other students as well. So following on from that, we don't care just about your academic achievements. Who are you really, and what do you care about? We do want to ask that as well, because, again, the PhD program is 5 to 6 years. You'll be stuck with the same people for a couple of years. You should at least like the people that you're working with or working next to. So we do care about the people as well. So, some ways that we see that demonstrated are things like, do you work to improve your community? Do you work with other groups on campus to improve the climate for your fellow students? Do you tutor? Do you volunteer elsewhere? Be academically or otherwise? Are there causes you really care about and have taken on leadership roles to address such causes? We care about all of that. We look at applicants as humans, not just research robots, and that's again something that's quite important to us at MIT Physics. And then I guess kind of the last point is that you want to emphasize that grad school is the right thing for you. What are your future career goals? What do you aspire to be? Do you want to be a professor back home and level the educational inequality between different groups? Do you want to transfer what you've learned and bring the knowledge back home? Do you want to continue your research in your desired field? Evidences that demonstrate that you are thinking about what graduate school means for you. Now, on the recommendation letters or the reference letters, I mentioned before that the application generally asks for 3. You can't control exactly what gets written in them, but there's some factors you can control. For example, you can ask professors who know you well. The best ones are usually the ones that you have worked with closely in a research setting. What are your contributions? What have you taken initiative to do? Have you led any of the project or sub-project or showed some sort of research direction? Having said that, we do look at research quite closely, but they don't have to all be research letters. It could be things like, did you do really well in the class, or did you really engage really heavily in the class? Have you asked questions of this one professor all the time? Have you gone to office hours? Did you ask lots of really inquisitive questions? That also is helpful. And then, once you've kind of identified who would be good to talk to, you can ask if they can write a strong letter for you. And strong is the key word there, because you want them to you want them to be the strongest advocate for you. Can they best speak to your capabilities, research and otherwise, in terms of research potential and in leadership as well. Have they seen you take charge at, say, open days at the university, or running a weekly seminar series, or for undergrads? When you're in grad school, you'll be leading projects, and learning those skills will be quite valuable as well. And another thing to stress is that if they can write anecdotes or stories illustrating any of what I've just said, that's great as well. It provides more detail to strengthen the case. And if they don't exactly remember the details, you can kind of jog their memory, and that's fine. You can just kind of summarize the story, and then they can write it again in their own words. And then the last 2 things is that, one, whoever the writer is, they don't necessarily have to be from your home institution. In this case, I kind of put in MIT for MIT students. And then the second thing is that if they say no, that's kind of fine, because maybe they don't know you as well, and they don't think they know that there's someone else who could write a better letter for you, and that's fine. Just make sure to thank them for the time, and then ask someone else instead. Okay. And then I think the second to last slide here, I kind of outline all the necessary stuff you need to keep track of, but then next question is what happens, at least at MIT, once you submit the applications. So this is information that's not too widely known, but happy to make public. So there's a portal that we use to manage all the applications, all 1,600 of them. There's a first round of reading where the admissions chair and the student readers, there are about 5 of us in total that take a look at all of the applications. But as of last year, the students don't get to read the reference letters. So, the students will still read everything else, the statement of objectives or purpose, personal statement, transcripts, etc. And there's an internal rubric that we use to base our judgment off, and then we assign points, and which we use to kind of track the applications. And then we produce a ranking based on those scores. We provide then a ranked list to the various faculty readers in various areas in physics. And that's sorted. And then what happens is that usually some of the faculty members will start at the top, and then they'll work their way down until they kind of reach the number of students that they are happy with. And then sometimes they look down the list a bit more just to make sure that we just in case the students might have missed something in the reading. But in general, all applications will definitely be read at least once. And then sometime in late January, early February, the committee will get together for one whole day from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. To discuss all of the candidates. So for example, in the 22-22 cycle, I said something like there was 1672 applications. In that cycle, when we sat down, we were discussing about 200 people who were shortlisted. And then we brought that number down to 90 that the department sends offers to. And then MIT Physics generally sends out the offers, including the rejections, about a week after, and that's somewhere between mid to late February. But then in general, all across the US, the last day you should hear back is April 15 on whether you're accepted or not. One other thing I didn't put in the bullet points is how exactly those numbers are decided. So every year, the numbers, the number of students that the department can kind of allow in, they do vary, and it varies on upon things like funding situations and the number of grad students at MIT. And we do have something like a so-called probability-based system. So for example, we think that international students are more likely to accept offers by MIT compared to, say, domestic students for whatever reason. A lot of that is based on past data. So there's some of it, there's no reason to it. We don't want to admit too many students, because if we admit too many students, then we don't have the money to fund them. But admitting too few students also doesn't really look good. And at the same time, MIT Physics doesn't do a waitlist system, because it's kind of annoying having to send staggered sets of letters as well. So there's a whole balance of issues and things to balance here, back and forth. The calculation is not as straightforward as one might think. Okay, so the last important point, my last major slide, is that first of all, applications are considered holistically. So, don't think of the application process in the US as like a checklist, right? So, it doesn't mean that if you take all of them that you get in, but it also doesn't mean, it also means that if you don't take all of them, it doesn't mean that you won't get in. So there's a lot of negatives there, but hopefully you get my point. And then finally, the second major bullet point there, one thing that I'm seeing a lot of in the last year compared to the last 3 to 4 years is that, you don't get too hung up on, having to, or thinking that you have to fixate yourself on to this research topic for the rest of your life. You're almost never locked in unless you want it to be. It's literally only your control. And, sure, in the first few years, most students will be working on topics that the advisors will kind of pass down to you. But during grad school, you'll be going to conferences, you'll be networking with other students and professors, you'll be learning new things, and you'll be collaborating on new topics with those people as well. The most important thing is to go to grad school, wherever it is, taking initiative to expand yourself. That's more important than worrying about the topic before you even get into grad school. And I always like to tell people that, opportunity is when luck meets preparation. So opportunities won't just come to you. Your favorite research topic won't just come to you. No one will tell you what to do. So it's up to you to chase them. Either I'm either happy to either send around the slides, or Devang can send around the recording afterwards. But these links here are all accessible if you search for MIT Physics on Google. Look for grad admissions, academic programs. The grad students at MIT Physics, they do run the Physics Graduate Application Assistance Program, or PhysGap. There's one-on-one mentoring that's available. Although the caveat is that that's only available to folks who are applying to graduate school in that current cycle. It's not meant to be like a year-long mentoring program teaching how to get into MIT physics or any physics PhD programs or whatever. So just to be clear about what it's for. And then we also run webinars. It's kind of something like what I'm doing today. But for more folks, we advertise that a lot more widely. And you will also be hearing from a panel of younger students who have most recently gone through the process, not like this ancient fossil here, fifth year who's about to graduate. You're not gonna you hear more from the younger folks. But also we have been running this for a couple of years now. Webinars from previous years are also on the website. You have the same sort of, we're sharing the same sort of information. So there's nothing particularly new, except you're hearing from more folks as well. And those are all on the department YouTube channel. And with that, I'm kind of done with the presentation aspect. I'm happy to take questions for the rest of the hour. I think we started 10 minutes late and happy to stay 10 minutes late as well.
Thank you so much for
There are a few
listening.
questions in the chat if you can look at it.
Yeah. So I see a first question about applicants who offer the PhD admission. How many first authors do they have? Yeah, so I mean, the average is definitely less than one. Not everyone has a paper. So I think this is a good opportunity for me to address something. So one thing, the average is definitely less than one. The average of number of students who have a co-author publication is quite a number. Having said that, there are a handful of students who have come in with 0 first author papers or 0 co-author papers. So that's the fact. Now, it's a very common thing that I'm seeing on social media that people are saying that you must have a first author publication to get into graduate school. I can see why from the outside it looks like that, but in reality, that's not true at all. We have rejected people who have had 3 or 4 first author publications, not because everyone has that number of publications. It's just because they don't have the right fit. They don't have the right skills for the professors who are looking for students. So that's, there are various other factors that come into play as well. And it's just the reality that I think this is especially more so in the US, that the professors are just giving students projects that result in papers quite easily because the data are just sitting right there. And obviously the data are taken by people who have lots of money, lots of resources, and so definitely professors from big name universities will produce students with first author papers. So that's that kind of, in my opinion, crappy, the richer gets rich kind of system in that sense. And that does create the illusion that you must have a first author paper to get into grad school. But at the same time, also, it's just that there are more people with first author papers now. So, what does this mean for you? There are a couple of ways, there, again, I talked about the various ways that you can demonstrate your competency for doing research. First author papers are not the only ones. Conference talks, talks at either your school or elsewhere. Posters are also possible. So I can just building that portfolio will be helpful. Hope to answer the question. Sorry, I did. Let me
There are
scroll
a
back.
few
I
more
only answered the
questions
latest
also.
question. Yes. Okay. So acceptable English communication test acceptable. Yeah. So I guess that's the IELTS, TOEFL, Duolingo. I'm not sure if Duolingo is accepted. My bet is no. For IELTS and TOEFL, they're acceptable. MIT does look at them. The scores are published on the website. So I'm not going to quote it off the top of my head because I don't know that number. Now, having said that, so I'm not sure about what the all of the ISAs are like, but if the language of instruction in ISAPOPO is English, you don't have to worry about doing an IELTS or TOEFL. Like you just don't have to. If you want to have peace of mind, sure. But you don't, honestly, you don't have to. It's a waste of money anyway. Okay, so then the question from Devang is about whether is it okay if all three recommendation letters are from outside the home institution? Yes, it's fine. Yeah. Although it depends on what the recommendation letters are like. Obviously, if you're choosing those three professors, I assume that they'll provide really good letters for you. The first question that I will be frank and say the first question we'll probably ask ourselves is, oh, why didn't they pick an advisor from their home institution? And sometimes the first thing that we'll think of is, oh, maybe they have just worked much more closely with folks from outside their home institution. That's fine. I think that's really all about it. When we look at the reference letters, we give you kind of we don't default to like a negative interpretation of whatever you decide, and we do tell students that you should bring forward your best case, and if those professors are the ones that can do that for you, great. But that question will linger in our head, but it won't be a problem. Okay, then okay, so I've answered the question about the first Osler papers. Okay, so how important is the GPA for PhD application abroad? Okay, so I'm not gonna lie and say that the GPA doesn't matter. It does to a certain extent. But again, I was saying that we do consider applications holistically. So for example, I believe all of the Indian higher education system has a GPA out of 10. We have admitted people with GPAs of like, close to 10, obviously, but we've admitted people GPAs like 8.48 or whatever, and I probably on occasion lower than that as well. But we don't admit those students in either the case where it's like close to 10 or close to 9 or 8. We don't admit them because of the GPAs, right? We also look at their research experience, the volunteering experience. We kind of look at the whole package, and it's something that I'll probably say over and over again. And it's not because I'm trying to avoid the question, it's because it is true that we don't look at just the GPA, we don't look at just your transcripts. Having said that, if your GPA is high because you have only taken like history classes and you're applying to do like quantum mechanics, that is a bit of a red flag. If say you have gotten all B's and C's in like quantum mechanics and electromagnetism for undergrad, we don't chuck away your application. We will be a little concerned about you, but if it can be made up by strong research background, that's something that we'll consider. Not saying that's guaranteed, but it's something that we will take into consideration as well.
So GPA
Another
is
thing, yes,
sorry to interrupt you. So
no worries.
GPA is like all the things are considered, even your GPA as well.
Yeah.
So it's not the main focus, it's just one of the focus.
Exactly, yeah. It will be like, it will be a primary focus, but it's not the only focus. It's definitely not the biggest focus. I would say the biggest focus that we look at are your research interests, and then the reference letters, and then GPA is kind of in the middle. It's not even the first thing that we care about, really. If you have a GPA of like 1, then at that point we're like, something really extraordinary has to be there. Otherwise, it will be difficult for us to consider you. The last thing I'll comment on this question is that, if say you have gotten like C's and D's in quantum mechanics in your first or second year, but then later on in your third year and fourth year, you have gotten like A's in advanced classes, that's great. That's something that we also take into consideration. Especially if in your first or second year, if you had some unfortunate incident that happened that caused you to lose focus in class, that's something that if you're comfortable to share, that's something we take into consideration as well. Okay, so another question on, if we have a certificate from the home institution stating that the language of course is English, we don't need TOEFL, right? Yeah, exactly. That's more than enough to do so. If you can avoid spending money on unnecessary crap like standardized tests, do it. It's honestly not worth the pain or money to do so. Okay, another question. So could you suggest a good timeline to contact professors there and start working on applications in order to fit in other documentations later, such as the visa process? Okay. So regarding contacting professors, so I assume this is limited only to kind of applying to graduate school. So my personal experience is that I've only really emailed 2 professors out of the 15 schools that I applied to, mainly because I don't like emailing people, but also because these professors get emails all the time about accepting students, and not just that, but also about research opportunities. So, whether they'll see your email and respond to you, that it's that probability is actually quite low. And it also means that if they don't respond back to you, it doesn't mean that they will they don't like you, or they don't think you're impressive or whatever. It's just that you have too many emails. Now, on the other side, if they email back to you and say, "Oh, you look good," it doesn't mean that you'll be accepted as well, because as I was just outlining the process at MIT Physics, but this is true for the country as well. There is a committee that decides the applications, and those professors are not always on the committee. And even if the professors are on the committees, they don't have the unilateral power to admit one person. So just keep that in mind. In terms of a timeline, though, you can kind of start anytime you want, but don't. I guess most applications are due in November-ish. Now is a good time to start reaching out to the professors or to the graduate students, to learn more about what the program is like, what the city is like. Again, 5 to 6 years of your life, you want to think about the sort of things as well. In terms of the visa process, you don't you will not worry about that until you get accepted to a school, and then you also won't worry about that until you work with the International Students Office to get your so-called I-20. That is something you only, if you're applying this year, you only need to worry about that sometime March or April next year. Having said that, as someone who's right now back home to renew my visa, something that's like I'm literally doing right now, you do want to start the process as early as possible. As many of you know, the consulates and embassies in India are extremely full right now. They're filled up. I've talked to the State Department on this in various capacities. I know that the Indian consulates and embassies, they are prioritizing student visas, so wait times for interviews should be very short, like compared to the tourist visas. So that's I think that's really it. Okay. Okay. In continuation of Gaurav's question, is it just at MIT or throughout the US that we don't require TOEFL or even IELTS? Yeah, it's a good question. So I'm definitely talking about just MIT. You want to look at the requirements and the language from the various different schools that you're thinking of. The language of instruction thing is quite safe, I would say. Having that letter. There are only very few schools that insist on having a TOEFL and IELTS. I think this is 5 years ago now, but the University of Urbana-Champaign in Illinois, UIUC, they're adamant on having a TOEFL for all international students for teaching purposes. I myself am from New Zealand, and they were asking for a TOEFL and IELTS, which I think at the point is ridiculous. But that's just UIUC. But it's something you should take a look at and ask if necessary. Does the last 60 credits have a special significance with regard to GPA? I assume, I don't have I'm not familiar with a credit system for undergrad, so I assume that's kind of like the last year or last 2 years, and whether that is significant to consideration. So like what I was just saying before, we don't look at just the number for the GPA. We do kind of go through a transcript and see what classes you've taken and what grades you've gotten in those classes as well. So, again, if you have shown an improvement in your grades from your first year to your fourth year, that's something we do. We like to see that as well. We do take that into consideration. Then question about, do institutions in the US provide good financial support for PhD students? So in general, I think that varies a lot. Pamita can tell you about what her experience is like at Ohio State. In general, I would say it's fine. Of course, different schools will have different numbers. Their private schools have different numbers for public schools as well. So I'll give a couple examples. And this is public information for the most part. MIT grad students before tax, so you still have to get tax taken out as well. We get paid about 45,000 US dollars a year. Now, it sounds high, even compared to other programs around the country, but that's also because Boston is really expensive. The rent in general is something like 1,000 to 1,500 US dollars a month. And that's very high compared to many other places around the country. Harvard gets paid around the same, Harvard students get paid around the same, but obviously that's because Harvard, MIT in the same city, so cost of living is high. Stanford also gets paid around 45, 46, 47,000, but the area around Stanford is high. Then let's go to kind of the more rural areas. So I was also offered Stony Brook University in New York. I think I was offered something like 27,000 a year, but then health insurance is not included, so take away 2,000 a year for that. 25,000 a year is kind of okay in the Long Island area in New York. You live not you won't live a luxurious lifestyle, but I think the most important thing is that if you're single, if you don't have a family that you're bringing over, that it'll be comfortable. I wouldn't say that you can go out every weekend to New York City and go to a lavish restaurant, but you'll be fine. And then Rice University, for example, I get the offer was something like 30,000 a year in Houston. That's not too expensive, so I think that it was good as well. And then I didn't get accepted to University of Arizona, but they were going to offer 30,000 a year. And if you know where the University of Arizona it's in Tucson, Arizona, and Tucson is, in my opinion, like, now that I know what rent in Boston is like, it's dirt cheap. So I feel like you'll be much better off in Arizona compared to MIT, just because the living cost is so different. Okay, another question on how will you compare the admissions process of other IB colleges? So to my understanding, it's quite similar. So obviously the professors are different. The thinking might be slightly different, but in terms of the way that we do things, it's quite similar. It's not like we coordinate our admissions processes. I will say that. But the schools, we do talk to them about what their experiences are like. What they've seen, what the patterns are, and the process. And while the individual schools will do their own thing, by and large, it's quite similar. And then another question here about, does nationality play any role in getting to MIT? So in terms of when we read your applications, no. So nationality, no. I will, it may seem as if the international students are looked not down upon, but we know that there might be some aversion to the international students. If anything, we're trying to make sure that we don't admit too many Americans. I will say that kind of partially on the record. Having said, that was only a half joke. But I will say that we don't really care too much about that. Now, going back to what I was saying before about the probability aspect. So this, let me repeat that, because that's kind of a subtle aspect in the whole application process. So earlier on, I talked about how the MIT, not just MIT, but all of the other schools as well, including schools that you may think are like not as popular, the committee, the first thing you want to do is to predict how many students will come to MIT, because there's only limited amount of funding available for students. You take that funding, you divide it by the average cost of a student, and you get the number of students you can have for the year. Now, say the number is 50. You can't just offer 50 offers to 50 students, because not all 50 students will accept, because maybe they want to go somewhere else, maybe they change their mind, whatever. So say the MITs try to send an offer to 100 and hope that only 50 will accept it. Now, how do you decide that those 100 students, right? Now, then you have to think about the demographics as well. So generally, what we have found, I don't know why, but we have found that women tend to accept MIT less than men. So you want to give more offers to women because you want to multiply that by the lower number, and then you get kind of the rough number of students on campus. Now, that means that what we see on our side is that there are way more international students that accept MIT's offer. And I will say that there are many more international men that accept MIT offers than any other groups in any other demographic group. So what that can look like is that in years where there are too many applicants, you might seem as if there are too few international men that get into grad school in the US. But that's not the case per se. It's just because there are many more international men that will be accepting offers than otherwise compared to the other demographic groups. So in that sense, there's a subtle way in which a subtle way in which the demographic plays into all of this. But again, this is kind of a second order thing that it's kind of good to know, but this should not be a consideration at all in going to graduate school. For one thing, it's going to be the same for every single school around the US. So it doesn't either. This shouldn't even factor in. But this is just something that I'm saying to kind of inform you how the process is like. So, but again, to kind of answer that question directly, no, with that as to whether nationality plays a role in getting to MIT. Okay, so typically NSF funds some of the institutes in the US, not sure about MIT, but does it play any role in admitting more local people compared to overseas students? Okay, so I'm not sure exactly how public schools work. Public schools are funded by the state themselves. There may or may not be stipulations in there. I don't think there are, not that I've heard of. But in terms of whether NSF or NASA or whatever, they don't play any role at all in admitting more students. So maybe part of what you're asking is about Americans can apply for the so-called NSF graduate research fellows program or something like that. And you're asking, I assume that's kind of what you're asking about, whether that affects admissions. So when students apply, they will tell us that they have apply to it, but they won't know what the students won't know whether they have gotten that fellowship until late in March. So and by that point, MIT will have already released the decisions. Most schools will have already released the decisions. So for us, for international students, that doesn't really matter. It only really matters for Americans who, say, by April 5th, haven't gotten an offer from any of the grad schools, but then they have gotten the NSF fellowship, and then those Americans can use that as leverage to the other schools. But that is, that will be very late in the process for Americans. That's really kind of the last resort for them. So in kind of for most purposes, at least, when us international students are thinking about our chances into getting to grad school, that's not going to be a consideration.
Right. Are there any questions? Please mention them in the chat box, or you can just unmute yourself or raise your hand if possible. Oh, there's
Okay, I
one.
see another question. Okay, if someone worked extensively in only one particular research area and not diversified their work, does that affect the application? So it depends. That's a good question. So obviously, if you want to stay on in the field, that helps a lot. Then in that research area, then also we also want to know what you have done, right? If you spend 4 years in the same lab and you've only worked on, say, one Python script with your grad student advisor, that's not going to be a good look. But if you have, say, even if you've done work in the same research area, but say, you've done practical experimental work, maybe you have done some optics alignment or something like that, and you've done simulations, and you have done some data analysis, that's good. You have shown that you can work in a variety of settings, even if you're working only on one field. Even if you want to apply to another field, say for example, you worked on optics alignment, you work on more AMO stuff, you have, again, like optics alignment, you've done data analysis for grad student or professor, and you've done like simulation work, but you want to get into, say, instrumentation for astronomy, or you want to even do like data analysis for X-ray astronomy, that's fine. You just have to sell yourself in a way that says that your skills are relevant to the work that you want to do. So let's continue the example. So, obviously, if you have optics alignment experience, then, if you want to work on astronomical instrumentation, that's already relevant information. In the work as well, you will be doing, in the PhD work for instrumentation, you will be doing some simulation work as well, and that's something you should highlight. And then the data analysis might not seem obvious, but you can say, oh, once the instrumentation is built, I want to answer these science questions, and my data analysis experience and my undergrad research area will help with that. And then, say if you're not going to go into any work that focuses on instrumentation or experimental part, you can say, well, you shouldn't say that the experimental aspects won't be useful in your future research. You should try to avoid negative framing. But you want to say that, I have picked up these skills from doing practical work. I've learned to problem solve. I've learned to not give up on problems. I've learned to, I've learned to seek help when I need it, and not just, wait for someone to tell me what to do. Those little things, they do add up to a strong application as well. So it's that, whether you've worked on one thing only for 5 years, or whether you've worked on 5 things over 5 years, either way, you just have to speak well to your experiences.
I don't see any more questions. Oh yeah, I think so. We are done with the questions, I guess, Mason. So
yeah, so yeah. Either
yeah,
way, I was happy to stay for another 10 minutes. I don't mind.
if anyone has questions, please mention them in the chat box, or you can raise your hand. I'll unmute you and allow you to ask a question. Till then, I have a question actually.
Yeah.
How would you compare like the entire admission process of the US universities as compared to the Europeans, or any other place, maybe like somewhere like Australia and New Zealand as well?
Yeah, good question. So the way that I classify the system, I think it's basically system outside of the US versus the US. So I think of the US system, the PhD system, more like program based, and outside the US more project based. So most of you might be familiar, when you're applying for a PhD in India, but same for Australia, New Zealand, the US, sorry, not US, Europe. You are applying to a project to work with a professor. Now, the system is very different. You're much more likely to be tied to a certain research area in that system compared to the US. And in that case, the application goes directly to professors that you want to work with in those countries. And so it means that reaching out to the professor is much more important than the US. And then, in Europe, New Zealand, Australia, there are basically no mandatory classes. You get started on research more right away. Some people like that. Some people are sick of classes, and I understand that. Some people, they do like the US system of having like classes for the first year or 2 years, and then focusing on research in the last 3 to 4 years. That takes longer, but some people like to take the time to get into research. They want to strengthen their background in physics or in whatever STEM field they're going into. And take the time to learn more about the research field that they're planning on going into. And in that sense, for all the reasons I outlined before, the application process is more about the program, more about the cohort per se, and thinking about the fit to the department, and that factor, the so-called fit thing, it's a secondary consideration when it comes to the European, Australian, New Zealand system. I'm not exactly sure about India, but I'm fairly confident about this for the Australian, New Zealand system. So, I have kind of started a PhD in Australia before I went to the US. Cohesion is not a factor at all. I can guarantee you that. Oh, someone asked about my grad school application experience. Okay, so I didn't know what the GRE was until the August before to apply. So that was great, because I needed to submit I needed to do a physics GRE, and I was like, which website even goes before this? And then I learned that to pay money to take the test, which is stupid. And then yeah, I mean, I can complain about that part all day long, but then I won't bore you about the details of my I guess I was gonna I guess on the personal statement and the statement of purpose. I wrote a lot of what I think is crap. I wrote big about on my personal statement and my statement of objectives, and I was very ambitious. Not It's definitely not who I'm now, but I guess a question that we wanted to ask was about kind of the schools and all. So I knew that I wanted to work on neutron stars. I didn't know whether it was X-rays or radio, or whether I wanted to work in simulations or stereo or whatever. I just cared about neutron stars. So I just really did a few basic Google searches on who works on neutron star stuff, and I applied to those schools. I applied to a lot of the top schools, although I did apply to quote unquote lower ranked schools as well, so that I would be reasonably certain that I'll get in somewhere. I would say the lowest ranked school that I applied to was the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. There's someone there who is a big name in neutron star simulation and theory, so that's the reason why I applied to it. But on the rankings, that school doesn't apply, rank highly. And then I think I just applied. I applied during my last semester of undergrad, so that was very stressful. And then I started getting rejections and offers. Earlier on I mentioned that I got accepted to Stony Brook. I also got accepted to Tennessee, Knoxville, and Rice as well. And then I heard MIT was the one I actually heard back first. And I told myself that unless I learned that Boston had like a shooting every single week, that I would not go to MIT. Now, I've kind of learned that Boston kind of has that, but when I got there, but it's kind of in the suburbs. But that's kind of a minor, secondary thing that I'll say now. And then the last thing I'll note for that question is that I also did apply to the University of Amsterdam in the Netherlands. I got shortlisted for it. I also managed to fly over to Amsterdam for the interview process. And that was it did not go well. Let me just say it did not help that I had a 12-hour time difference with Amsterdam and from New Zealand or Australia when I went there, but it is what it is. I'm at MIT now, so screw it. So that was my overall application. That you should not find inspiration from my experience. You should only just hope to be better than me, and honestly that's not that hard to do. Okay, so another question about personal experiences at MIT and the department culture. So there are lots of things I can say about that. So let me just talk specifically about Astro first. So MIT Astro is it's a wonderful place. If anything, I wish that the students were quieter and less noisy and less distracting. Like, we typically go into the office not to work. It's a bit too fun. So it's quite nice in a way. You always feel like you belong somewhere in MIT Astro. The department is a bit more varied. My understanding is that the theoretical physicists, they keep to themselves a bit more. I'm not trying to invoke any stereotypes whatsoever. It's just the reality. And then the various research groups, they all stick together. For the most part, it's quite cordial. Now, having said that, there are no departments or there are no universities which are perfect. So let me start at the very top first. So MIT being MIT is a big name. MIT attracts lots of big, wealthy people. Some of you might have heard the name Jeffrey Epstein. The guy who presumably killed himself in prison, but he was also financing some of the professors at MIT and at Harvard. And also he was a sexual harasser, and there was a whole rightfully a lot of controversy around MIT accepting Jeffrey Epstein's money. I think MIT broadly has done the right thing, but there are some professors who have not done the right thing, including professors in physics. And there are some ways that the department could have handled it better. But it is something that I will continue to tell people that this MIT is not perfect. MIT also accepts money from Mohammed bin Salman, Crown Prince in Saudi Arabia. I don't think that's not great either. And then going to the department itself. So for the most part, the department is great. Other than the things that I mentioned just before, that the department has some kind of relations to, but things like systemic racism, structural racism, particularly of African Americans, but also just of various students, some students in general as well, that is seen. But the great thing is that those incidents are isolated, and if people know, if other students know about it, we will for sure be more than ready to take out our figurative pitchforks and start marching around the department asking for change. And the leadership is quite good in hearing the students out and thinking about the solutions that should be in place. My advisor is actually the department head. And I know that he, first of all, doesn't have time for me because he's dealing with all of these problems. But making sure that students are thriving, are happy, and that their main focus is research and not some bullshit problem that they don't want to see. There's something that the department prioritizes quite heavily, and I can confidently say that about MIT physics. So in your 5-6 years at any, not MIT physics, but any program, you will face issues, but there'll be people around you who will help you when push comes to shove.
I don't think so there are any more questions. So I guess we can end over here. Thank you so much, Mason, for coming here and giving us such valuable input into the admission process, not only in MIT, but as well as other graduate schools. It was really helpful, and I hope every one of us will take something from this. So thank you so much, Mason, once again.
Yeah, no worries. And Devang, I'll send you the slides, and more than happy to send
I'll share it to everyone.
Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys, for attending. I will share all the slides that Mason shared with us, and please keep attending more fun talks like this. Thank you so much. Thanks, Mason.
Cool. Thank you, everyone.